if the issue that the majority has with reopening is related to vaccinations, I understand the majority claims that their side is 100% vaccinated. And I would just say that if that is the case, science says that they have nothing to worry about coming to the House floor or being in public. But that's not what this is all about. This is about the Speaker holding on to her slim and tenuous majority by any means necessary, even if weaponizing the House rules to do so. If we do defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to provide for consideration of Representative Mast's H.R. 261, the Palestinian International Terrorism Support Prevention Act of 2021. I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment into the record along with the extraneous materials immediately prior to the vote on the previous question. And Madam Speaker, the Israelis
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, the Israelis are among our greatest allies and a critical strategic partner in the international fight against terrorism, and Congressman Mast understands this better than most. H.R. 261 sanctions foreign governments and persons that provide support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Madam Speaker, I yield 10 minutes to the representative from Florida's 18th Congressional District.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 10 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Why at this time should we come together bipartisanly on this vote? That's the question that I'm going to attempt to answer. Members of this body, they're going to have the opportunity as we move forward here to either support Hamas or to not, to fight against them. The choice will be made. People will decide which direction they want to go. My bill, H.R. 261, the Palestinian International Terrorism Support and Prevention Act of 2021, would make clear that the United States stands with Israel and would sanction those who provide financial support to Hamas. It's that simple. Now, why do we need to do that? Why is it important to come together on this? To put a fine point on it, this is not one pissed off Palestinian that picked up a shoulder-fired RPG and put it on their shoulder and fired it 100 yards over at Israel. That's not what we're talking about here. Hamas is sophisticated. They're well organized, and there's a complex infrastructure involved in getting them their weapons. They don't just go down to the Gaza Strip rocket depot in order to pick up these things. They're smuggled across Iraq, Syria, Jordan, into one of the most densely populated areas of the world without anybody noticing or saying anything. That is why we need these sanctions. Why should we come together bipartisanly on this to support our friend and ally Israel, to stand against Hamas? Because the rockets that Hamas smuggles and fires at Israel, they're not science fair bottle rockets. Many of them, Fahar 5 missiles, 21 plus feet long. That's longer than a Chevy Suburban. Hundreds of pounds of explosives on the end of that. The explosives that detonated underneath my legs, about 5 to 10 pounds of explosives, to put that into perspective. Why come together bipartisanly to support this? Because Hamas is not firing these rockets in order to make a pretty fireworks show. They use these missiles specifically to target large towns and cities with the expressed hope of killing Israeli civilians like so many that we've heard about. Edo Abigail, 5-year-old boy who was murdered when shrapnel from a rocket ripped through his window in a fortified room that he was hiding in with his mother. Or Daniel Traegerman, a 4-year-old Israeli boy, killed by a mortar shell fired by Hamas in 2014. Somai Sentoj, killed when a rocket attack on Israel fired by Hamas on May 11th detonated so close to her. She worked as a caretaker to an elderly woman who had been living in Israel for the last 7 years. These individuals and so many others, they're not just collateral damage. They and millions of other Israeli civilians are targeted. They're targets of Hamas. After I was blown up in Afghanistan, I volunteered to serve alongside the Israel Defense Force. And there I served alongside soldiers that were driven by their love for their fellow man rather than by hatred for their enemies. And I had the honor of getting to know some of the most creative and caring people that I've ever met, who adapted to some of the worst situations that anybody could be placed into. Every family that I encountered during my time in Israel, they shared a desire for their children to grow like we do and to be educated safely without the looming threat of war. And I learned at the Shabbat tables of my hosts there just how much each family truly desires peace between every neighbor of Israel, regardless of religion, regardless of history. They don't want to be attacked. They want to live in peace. They want to see their children grow. So why support bipartisanly this legislation? Because Hamas, on the other hand, uses their own people as shields and cannon fodder. They don't stand for their people. They don't defend their people. They stand behind their people. They build their command and control infrastructure inside hospitals and schools. They launch their missiles from heavily populated areas. And this recent round of fighting between Hamas and Israel is exactly that, a round in an ongoing conflict that goes back decades. Hamas has consistently launched thousands and thousands of rockets into Israel, killing and maiming hundreds of civilians. Why come together bipartisanly? Because in the last week alone, they've fired more than 3,000 rockets into Israel. In April, this didn't make the news, but in April, over 44 rockets fired into Israel. In January, 3 rockets fired into Israel. That's just this year. Why come together bipartisanly? In 2020, more than 130 rocket attacks. In 2019, 650 rocket attacks. In 2018, 350 rocket attacks. That's more than one a day. Imagine if that was going on here in the United States. Why come together bipartisanly? To make sure that we sanction the enablers of Hamas. In 2016, Hamas bombed a bus in Jerusalem, killing 2, wounding 21. At another time, Hamas suicide bomber killed 1, injured 9. Another bombing, Palestinian Islamic Jihad claims responsibility for the suicide bombing in a neighborhood bakery. Another bombing in a shawarma restaurant in Tel Aviv killed 11, wounded 70. Palestinian Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility, one of the listed sanctioned groups in this bill. In another bombing at a vegetable market, 7 people killed. Palestinian Islamic Jihad claims responsibility. At another bombing, 2 commuter buses in Beersheba, 16 people killed, wounding over 100. Hamas claims responsibility. Why is this bill needed? Why do we need to come together? Because Hamas does not finance terrorism with bake sales. They receive significant support from individual groups and foreign governments like Iran. The U.S. government has estimated that Iran by itself has provided as much as $100 million annually to Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and to other Palestinian terrorist organizations. These foreign sponsors seek to bring death to the Jewish state. It's that simple. Under my bill, the United States will sanction these groups that are supporting terrorism. Or if we do not pass this bill, we will not stand together to sanction these groups that are enabling this terrorism. This is common sense, which is why it passed the House of Representatives without any opposition last Congress. The bill even includes humanitarian exemptions that Democrats in the Foreign Affairs Committee wrote last Congress before all voting in favor of this piece of legislation. Given the ongoing attacks on Israel and the bipartisan support for this bill last Congress, I've asked that this bill be expedited for consideration again. Unfortunately, some of our colleagues are now pushing the opposite direction for the United States to withhold American weapon shipments to Israel, but they will not support steps to cut off the flow of weapons and funding from Iran to Hamas. that's killing our Israeli friends. There is a false equivalency that is going on, and there is a rooting for a terrorist organization that is happening as well. So, Mr. Speaker, this is my request. Madam Speaker, you supported this bill, many of you 2 years ago. Support it again now. Stand with our ally Israel, stand against Hamas, stand against their enablers, and pass this bill unanimously. Madam, I yield back to you.
The gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves.
Reserves.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Madam Speaker, with all due respect to my colleagues, I must respectfully decline to chase the red herring that's been lobbed onto the House floor. A vote on the procedural question is a vote on the PQ is strictly a procedural vote to move a bill forward, and as our colleagues know, voting no would simply mean that we would hand control of the House floor to them, which I decline to do. As our colleagues know, they're under no obligation to offer any specific amendment, even if they faithfully promise to do so. So let's not distract from the bills that we're here to move forward today. Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, the lead sponsor of House Resolution 398, recognizing the forthcoming centennial of the 1921 Tulsa massacre, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman